Well, I'm not seeing a number go up, so we're going to jump in, get started for today. Hello, again, for those who don't know me, I'm Mike Saramella. I'm the Seafood Safety and Technology Specialist with New York Sea Grant, and as of September of last year, the Director for our Seafood HACCP Alliance. I also serve as the Chair of our Community Engagement Work Group, and as part of that work group, we are hosting free webinars annually on various topics based on feedback from our participants. During our last webinar, which was an update from the Seafood HACCP Alliance Executive Committee, we received some feedback indicating that it would be nice to have a review of some of the models that are less frequently used for training purposes. So we've got Doris Hicks, the chair for our models work group here today, who's going to, in a minute, walk us through the Salmon Sushi Rolls model, which was indicated as one of the lesser used models, as well as talk about some other resources, such as our tips and tricks document that's available on the Florida Sea Grant program website. But before we do that, I just want to share a couple updates from the Alliance. The first is going to be in regards to our protocol, our various correspondences, and the website language and the language that's used throughout our various documents as programs, trainings. We often in the past have used the terms participant and student interchangeably. So we're trying to create some more consistency there and stick with one. So we've settled on participant. So we've changed all the language in the protocol as well as in the guide and are working through various other documents. But you should see that coming down the line where we're using the term participant as opposed to student in most of their resources. Also the terms trainer and instructor. You will see trainer being used more frequently now. We're going to transition everything over to in trainer as opposed to instructor. The only instance where you might see the term instructor used will be with relation to the train the trainer instructors. Everyone else is a qualified seafood HACCP trainer. The other update we want to share is there's going to be a drafted promotion guide for any Seafood HACCP Alliance courses that's going to be shared with any course approval emails that you get from here on out. That's going to give you some guidance on how to effectively promote and language that can and should be used when talking about Seafood HACCP Alliance trainings, specifically geared around the terms like certified. The Seafood HACCP Alliance is not technically certifying anybody. We're offering a training program and you are a trained individual after completing the Seafood HACCP Alliance trainings, but it's technically not a certification. So there's no AFTO certified Seafood HACCP trainers. You are just a trained individual. So it has information on that language and what's appropriate to be using when promoting the HACCP Alliance courses. And again, that'll be included in any course approval emails that you receive from AFTO. And the last thing I'm excited to announce is the executive committee has agreed and approved a new or 3 new at-large positions on the executive committee that will be open to the seafood community. Anyone who is interested can then put in an application, which will open in the next month or so, to be part of that executive committee. Initially, there'll be 1, 2, and 3-year terms, and you'll be able to indicate your preference as to how long of a commitment you want to make, with the option of reapplying and renewing those terms, which will then be 3 years, so that every year we'll be adding a new at-large position on a rotating cycle. Again, we'll be providing more information on these new positions and a better way for you in the seafood community to get more engaged on the executive committee. You can take a look out for an email, probably maybe in the follow-up email for today's webinar, a link to a document that provides more clarity and guidance on what this means, what your role would be as an at-large position, and kind of the expectations of applying for that, as well as that application process. So with that, I'll just say a little housekeeping logistics. If anybody has questions, make sure you raise your hand, and Christina, our administrator for today with AFTO, can unmute you so you can ask that question verbally. You can also feel free to put questions in the chat and I'll be there monitoring them as well. But with that, I'd like to pass it over to Doris to get us started on a review of our Salmon Sushi Rolls model.
Okay, thanks, Michael. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Doris Hicks. I'm retired from the University of Delaware Sea Grant program. I was their seafood technology specialist, and I have been involved with the Seafood HACCP Alliance since it was formed, and have been working to develop training on Seafood HACCP since the regulation, or before the regulation became effective. So I've been around seafood HACCP for quite some time. And today, as Michael told you, we're going to review the salmon sushi roll model. Before we jump into that, I believe Michael sent everybody a copy of the Tips for Trainers, January 2024. And these are tips for conducting practical exercises. And I wanted to make sure that everybody was aware that this is on the Florida Sea Grant website. It has been updated, and it reviews all of the steps that the participants follow when they break out into their groups. And it reminds trainers that they need to use the models that are on the Florida Sea Grant website. They need to be the Seafood HACCP Alliance models. And there are recommendations for the small groups to be 6 people or less. And that is something that you'll get a feel for as you teach the different models or the students work on the different models. And it goes through every part step by step with bullets giving more details. And one of the things that it also points out that I'll mention is that you can use either the landscape or portrait version of the HACCP plan. I will say that we're leaning towards putting all the models up with HACCP with the portrait form in the future, but that is up for discussion. And if anybody feels strongly that every single model should have every single type of HACCP plan format, that's fine. The other thing you can do, we were just concerned about the number of pages. If you hand out a hard copy to your students, that's a lot of paper. Electronically, it wouldn't matter which way it was presented. And as long as you use the fillable forms, all the information that you include on the hazard analysis and the HACCP plan forms will be available to your students. Okay, let's get into the salmon sushi roll. And this is relatively brief. Whenever you're planning a course and you're applying to AFDO via the online registration form for your course, you will be asked what model you plan to use. And there are lots of ways to determine this. You may be teaching an in-house type of training, and you'll pick models that are closest to what you produce. If you're opening your course to the general public, you'll get a variety of people represented in your class, from regulators to industry to distributors, consultants. All of these people can be in your training program. So that kind of opens it up. In this graph here, this is the results of what people said they would teach during their course since they started asking that question with the online form. So up at the top, we have oyster shell stock. Down at the bottom, we have the wholesale distribution short version. And I have also been involved with the model revision or work group committee. And we have recently revised 5 models. And one of those was the wild salmon sushi roll. So since it was kind of in the middle, I thought it might be a good place to start for the review process of some of these different models. if we do this again next year, if you have suggestions for which ones we should review next year, or create a webinar series just on the models, we can do that as well, possibly. All right, here's our salmon sushi roll model. Okay, I'm just trying to set up my screen here. We have revised the note at the top, and as you can see at the top of the model, it says revised February 2025. And that we are using the most recent version of the FDA's hazard guide based on the FDA.gov website. All right, so, oops, that doesn't work. We have all the information at the beginning for the narrative, and this is what you explain to your student groups that they read over. We have the name of the product, the salmon, market name, its source, wild caught, frozen, purchased from another processor. We describe what the food is, the method of receiving, storage and distribution, finished product type, and intended use and consumer. Okay, this is a relatively brief beginning of the narrative. And then the next part is the students are provided with is a detailed description of the process. And we explain that it's very important to be very specific in all of these steps so that you can do your hazard analysis and HACCP plan. So all the steps are listed here, along with what's accomplished at each of these steps. I'm not going to read all of these, okay, because we'll talk a little bit more about them when we get to the hazard analysis. Okay, this didn't all fit on one page. I didn't want to make it too small to see. And everything should be there for the students to read through. Here is our wild salmon sushi rolls process flow chart. And it's pretty self-explanatory. All the steps that were listed in the narrative are repeated here in the order in which they're dealt with. Now, things like dry ingredients, packaging materials, and the fresh seafood, they're on two sides of the flow chart. And some people will start with the left side, some people will start with the right side. Whatever makes the most sense to the group when they sit down to do the hands-on exercise. Okay. Do we have some questions? What did I do?
There are some questions in the chat right now, Doris. I can go through. Scott, the 2025 version of this is not yet on the website, but should be coming soon.
Thank you so much for noticing that. We have been working very hard to update all of the models based on the updates to the FDA guide and the Blue Book. And this, we're getting very, very close. And these 2025 versions will be updated to the Florida website within a couple of weeks. Okay. This is the final review. And that was another reason why I chose this model. There were a few things that we came across during Train the Trainer last month in Portland, and we will incorporate those changes and add them to the Florida website. Thank you for noticing that.
Doris, the
Yes.
other question was about what about the receiving of the vinegar? And I believe that was addressed in the flow chart in the new one.
Yeah, it's a note. Vinegar comes in plastic containers. The total process time after rice is cooked through the pack and label step is no more than 2 hours in refrigerated room.
And yet we will let the, through the seafood community list, we'll let everybody know when the new models are up and available. And there is also an option on the website for where you can send comments or suggestions for changes to models. And I'll find that and put a link to that in the chat while Doris continues.
Yeah, we first tried to get input on the models over the years through the Seafood HACCP Alliance and really did not get many comments. I think conducting these seminars or webinars are going to be very helpful to getting more input from all the people that are out there training. Okay, so we covered the flow chart. Were there any questions about the flow chart? Michael?
I think the main question was, and it might need to still be addressed, is the receiving of the vinegar is not on there.
Receiving vinegar.
So thanks, Scott. And then Deb asked another question about ocean freshwater. Yes, I believe in the initial description, it does state ocean.
Wild caught salmon, frozen, purchased from another processor. Okay. Michael, please remind me about the vinegar.
Sure.
Okay. Anything else? Okay, let's keep going. To help your students get started, we use this product description form, and it kind of summarizes the important issues about where it's purchased, how it's received, how it's stored, how product is shipped, how product is packaged, how it will be consumed, intended consumer. All these factors listed here can have an impact on the hazard analysis and eventual HACCP plan. So this is a form that is used by instructors to help the students get started or begin to organize their thoughts on how the hazard analysis will proceed. Along with this portion here, where they need to list all the potential food safety hazards based on the product description and the processing flow diagram. Okay, and this is where they refer back to the tables in the guide, table 3-2 for species-related hazards. And that's broken into vertebrates and invertebrates. And then 3-4 is process-related hazards. And in reviewing the book, the guide for your species, they discover that parasites could be a potential hazard, and that's in chapter 5. We recommend they indicate what the chapter is that they are going to go back and review when they do the hazard analysis. Okay, then you have pathogenic bacterial growth, temperature abuse, and that's in chapter 12. And then there's a note here that it's not specifically listed in the FDA for potential hazards, the specific pathogen of concern in cooked rice is Bacillus cereus, and this is controlled by rice acidification and should be included as a potential hazard. And this is mentioned in the hazard guide on page 217. And when we first started using the salmon sushi roll model, the students very quickly found the guidance for acidifying rice. And it's been very helpful going forward when teaching this model. Then we have food allergens, because we're dealing with salmon, food intolerance, substances, process-related hazard, and then metal inclusion is another process-related hazard. We mentioned sanitation here, just to remind students that sanitation is monitored through all processing steps and the daily sanitation control procedure records that accompany HACCP records. Were there questions related to the product description the product description and listing the potential food safety hazards?
I think we addressed most of those. There was the one about wild ocean caught, and yes, Deb, it is. I did confirm it's up there in the description. It says ocean caught.
Right.
Packaging materials was a question. What about packaging materials? Was that in the, let's see, process flow? Is that what you're referring to there, Scott? And the last question Scott has in there is related to the hazard analysis later on.
Okay, because we do have received dry ingredients, pack and label.
Packaging materials are not currently in there.
Okay. Okay. Next, we have our hazard analysis. At the top of the worksheet, we list a summary of the product description, method of storage and distribution, and intended use and consumer. Okay. We are using the inclusive method for the hazard analysis, such that at every step, as you can see in column 1 and then in column 2, all of the potential food safety hazards that can be associated with the product and process are listed in column 2. And the ones from the previous page, parasites, pathogenic bacterial growth, food allergens, food intolerance substances, and metal inclusion are all listed at each step. And we have gone with this inclusive step so that no hazards are left out. And it is kind of a HACCP step, almost, to make sure you don't leave anything out at any step. And it may seem like a lot of cutting and pasting or writing when the students are filling out these forms. And if it's an especially cumbersome model, once you make sure your work groups have identified all the potential food safety hazards, you could potentially give them a form that has columns 1 and 2 already filled out to save time. If you have a large class, a lot of groups, or you need to increase your group to 6 or 7, if there's only 6 or 7 people in the course, that might be helpful. All right, so we've done that. I didn't squeeze the whole hazard analysis onto one slide. Okay, you can see all of the, oops. All of the steps are listed, and then all of the potential hazards are listed in column 2. Then you see a lot of no's on this first slide of the hazard analysis. The third column asks if this potential food safety hazard is significant. And by that, we mean, is it introduced, enhanced, or eliminated at this step? Yes or no? And then we always remind our students when they're working on the models that if you say yes in column 3, at some point in the hazard analysis, you'll identify that step, not that as a CCP. It may not be dealt with at that step, but there'll be a step later in the hazard analysis and eventually moved over to the HACCP plan where that will be, you go into greater detail or you describe what the CCP is and all the parts to that. Okay, and receive ingredients. In column 3, it's all no. And the decision is justified in column 3. And it helps to provide a short, brief sentence, not a sentence or bullet, explaining why you made that decision. And we have receive ingredients, storage, and receive frozen salmon. Okay, and the only yes at this step is food allergens. And the justification is salmon is a food allergen. And in column 5, you list the control measure that would be applied to the significant hazard. And for allergens, the allergen of salmon, finished product label applied at pack and label will identify the fish market name salmon. The last column 6, is this the CCP? Yes or no? We just stated that it'll happen at the finished product label step. So in column 6, you would put a no. FIS or food intolerance substances, no additives are used, metal inclusion, not likely to occur at this step. I saw the comment numbers go up. Are there comments at this point?
Yes. So one of them is related to the hazards associated with dry ingredients. Those are the same listed in chapter 3 there for salmon and not specific to those dry ingredients. So would that be, would you change them and remove those hazards and only put the hazards associated with the dry ingredients in those columns or rows?
In column 2?
In column 2, yep, for the previous slide where you were doing dry ingredients, or potentially here for cooked rice. Again, you're not dealing with the fish, but we have all the hazards there for fish. I don't know if you have a comment to that, Doris, or I can.
Well, we've always included all the steps and all the hazards at every step.
Mm-hmm. And I would add there that the main hazard associated with the non-seafood ingredient of concern is that Bacillus cereus, which technically fits under the pathogen growth due to temperature abuse. So you could clarify, and a lot of times we do in class, is that you specify specifically which pathogen you're concerned with in that step, as opposed to the other steps, it's just generic or general. Unless if you want to add, if there was other hazards you're thinking of related to those dry ingredients that you think should be added there. So then, Claudia, are you assessing dry ingredients of rice and nori seaweed as potential hazards? I was like, yes, you should be including those. And again, that fits within the pathogen growth due to temperature abuse. But you could also put a separate line there if you so chose. But in the model, that would be included in there. And maybe that's something we can note and make that specific Bacillus cereus note in that particular column.
Wow. Okay. All right.
Yep. And then the last one was storage of dry ingredients. So we're looking back. I'm putting a note in our Word template for this and comment there to remind you, Doris, of the comments made for that model.
Okay.
Process flow.
Okay. The next section in the hazard analysis is frozen storage, and it should say salmon frozen storage. That's why I stuck that there as a reminder to myself that that needs to be updated. Okay. And in column 2, we list the potential hazards that we found in the product description form. And there are parasites, pathogenic bacteria, food allergens, food intolerance and substance metal inclusion. And the only yes is food allergens. And it's the same as the receipt of frozen salmon. Okay, and that will be addressed in the finished product label. Next is cooked rice. Again, we have the same parasites, pathogenic, but it's a no in column 3 for all of those potential food safety hazards. Next is rice acidification, and we say yes in column 3 for pathogenic bacterial growth, temperature abuse, and we justify that decision. Bacillus cereus could grow and form toxins if cooked rice is time temperature abused. And this information is found on page 217 of the guide. And yes, it's a CCP. Food allergens, it's not a major food allergen. No additives are used, and it's not likely to have metal inclusion. Next step is to prepare the salmon. One thing we didn't really cover, or did we? Okay, the receipt of frozen salmon, parasites are not an issue because it's controlled by the supplier with freezing. And it's the same for the step here for prepare salmon. Pathogenic bacterial growth, not reasonably likely to occur because it's a short time at this step and it's done in a chilled room. And this is where it's very important to have that information in the process narrative. Food allergens, again, it's the same as previously, but it's not going to be controlled while you're preparing the salmon. It'll be the weight pack label. No additives are used, and metal inclusion is not likely to occur. Next, we have assemble nori, rice, and fish into rolls. Parasites, it's no, it's controlled by the supplier. Bacterial pathogen growth, time, temperature abuse. This is done very quickly, not likely to occur. And again, it's done in a chilled room. Then we have our food allergen. Again, being dealt with at the weight pack label. No additives are used. And then metal inclusion is, again, no. I wonder sometimes when you talk about sushi, maybe people don't do this model because they're not familiar with sushi, or they're not interested in sushi, their students aren't interested in it, but it's a good example of getting across the message that you have the safety hazard of allergens that are carried throughout the process, but the CCP doesn't occur till another step. Some CCPs occur right at the step where it's happening, like the rice acidification. So it's a good illustration of that. Those types of things. All of the models were chosen to help illustrate something that might come up when you're doing your hazard analysis and your eventual HACCP plan. And a lot of these things were talked about in the training of the Blue Book. You may have 3 CCPs for one step, or if you're doing the wholesale distribution model, you can group like products because they have similar hazards. All the models illustrate something relevant to doing seafood HACCP. So when we first started talking about HACCP, we almost called it a state of mind. And you basically immersed yourself in understanding how to apply it to seafood processing. And the seafood industry is very lucky to have the guide as guidance to help them in this process. So I'll keep going. I didn't mean to go off on a tangent here, but the next step is to cut the rolls. Very similar yeses in column 3. Then we come to the pack and label. And we say yes in column 3 for food allergens. And the justification is salmon is a food allergen. Seafood is one of the 9 now major food allergens, and it has been forever. So in column 5, we have the finished product label applied at pack and label, and this will be used to identify the fish market name, salmon. And yes, in column 6, this is a CCP. Next, we have finished product storage, refrigerated storage, and yes, in column 3 for pathogenic bacterial growth, temperature abuse. Pathogens can grow in storage if rolls are exposed to temperature abuse conditions. That is our justification in column 4. To control, time and temperature controls are listed in column 5, and yes, this is a CCP. Okay, any questions, additional questions related to the hazard analysis?
There are several questions or comments that came in. One, under preventive controls for human foods rule, many of these ingredients would require supply chain preventive control. So if it's considered a fish or fishery product, it's subject and regulated under seafood HACCP, not under preventive controls for human foods. But the hazard analysis and risk-based preventive controls for human food guidance is a good resource to point participants to get a better sense of what are hazards associated with these non-seafood ingredients that they would need to control in their HACCP plan, which only requires the process controls. There's a question on decomposition, cadaverine, putrefacting. Should that be considered the new guidance? Are you familiar with that, Doris?
In salmon?
So I'm not sure if Yvonne, if you want to, if you'd like, raise your hand and we can unmute you if you want to provide some clarity. Is that specifically for the histamine? Okay. And while we're waiting on some clarity on that, I'll go to Claudia mentioning Sushi Model. She often uses it to add sesame to compare seafood versus, and also to compare seafood versus non-seafood sushi rolls. So, and those non-seafood sushi rolls like California rolls or the veggie rolls might not be under seafood HACCP. That might be preventive controls for human foods in that case, because it's not containing those seafood ingredients.
I thought about that. I caught myself and said there were 9 major food allergens. The new one is sesame seed. So potentially there could be like a California roll, might be covered with sesame seeds, and that might, I don't know if it, yeah, that's a good question to sort out. We can get copies of all these comments and questions, correct, Michael?
Yes, I believe, well, actually, I'll confirm with Christina. If you could let me know, the recording does include the chat, correct? Otherwise, I'll copy and paste.
Yes, we can save the chat.
Perfect.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, we'll clarify that for everybody. Okay. So we have identified 3 CCPs, and we highlight this in the flow chart with a shaded step. Rice acidification is the first CCP. Pack and label is the second, and finished product refrigerated storage is the third. And this is the portrait format. People like this format because you can include more information, and it's clear. All the information is provided in this format. To defend the landscape version, people like to see it all on one page and read across. Sometimes the inspectors are more familiar with the landscape form and may ask for it. But the same information will go on both types of forms. And here we list the step, rice acidification, the significant hazard, the critical limits for each control measure. And where do the students get this information? They get it from the guide, okay? And the same goes for monitoring. What will be monitored, how it will be monitored, when, and who does the monitoring. So for rice acidification, we have time and pH of the rice, the clock and pH meter, each batch, and the quality control person. I have not been able to confirm this, but I found in my notes that on page 421 in the guide, we're not supposed to hold the rice for more than 3 hours. So I put this in the corrective action. I need to confirm this. And when you look at these corrective actions, you'll see the if and then highlighted or bolded. And I think it's important to include that in the CCP because it emphasizes what's going on. If the equilibration time is not met, then the rice will be on hold until it reaches the 30-minute time frame. The product is evaluated and procedures for the future are prevented, and maybe staff need to be trained. So if the critical limit is exceeded, how will you fix it, and how will you prevent it from happening in the future? So I like to see that in the corrective action statements, if and then. All right. Next is verification, and we have our daily review of the acidification batch log, corrective action reports, the performance of accuracy checks and/or calibration of the pH meter before each use. A validation study is on file that validates the equilibrium time for 30 minutes to yield a stable pH or less than or equal to 4.3. One thing that should be added to this last part of the CCP are records. We should need to add training records to it, okay? And you also need to have the specific name of each of the records, okay? Are there questions, additional questions at this point?
Yeah, Doris, so we got some clarity. It was referring to Chapter 8, and thanks. I think Deb responded to that question, but essentially Chapter 8 is, while there, and gives a little bit of very brief background on that. It's not really covered, and if you look at the tables in Chapter 3, it's not even included in those tables. So it wouldn't come up as a potential hazard. So it's not going to be something that we're going to put in our models, because those are essentially helping you navigate and understand how to navigate the guide. But it's not bad to note that with participants in your trainings, that also, if you're aware of these other decomposition related hazards that are occurring in your product, largely most likely due to consumer complaints, you can and should be controlling them in your HACCP plan and putting them and including them in your hazard analysis. But I don't think it's appropriate to put them in the models themselves, since there really isn't a lot of guidance on that in the book itself. Let's see. So comment from Claudia just about if then matches that the Blue Book teaches, and Deb's just being clear that the regulation only requires records for monitoring, right? Optional records are listed just so they understand the other regulatory requirements, but monitoring, is that correct? I'm gonna just be clear. The only records that need to be listed are monitoring records in the HACCP plan itself, technically. So maybe that's something we consider if we want the models to only list those required, or should they do all? Because then Scott's comment down here, should they mention verification, review, monitoring, corrective action, verification, and review within 1 week?
Yeah, I think we need to go back to the Blue Book. We spent a lot of time listing all of these records and attaching them to the CCPs. So I think it would be helpful to list them all, but again, you're only required to list the ones that are for the CCP, for controlling the hazard. Okay, here's our pack and label. Significant hazard is food allergens. Making sure that the market name salmon is on the ingredient list, and the ingredients listing on the finished product labels is what you're monitoring. How? Visual comparison of a label against the product specification for accuracy at the start of production and at least every 2 hours, and the packing supervisors, the personnel that will take care of this. Okay, and then we have our corrective action, if then stated, our verification, including weekly review of monitoring and corrective action records, and then our records that are part of the CCP. And here we have our finished product refrigerated storage, the information on bacterial growth, temperature abuse is on page 225 in the guide. The critical limits for each control measure is the product is held at a cooler ambient temperature of 40 degrees or below. And what will be monitored, the cooler temperature, how continuous time and temperature recorder and visual checks. When continuous monitor by the recorder with visual checks at least once per day, and the cooler manager will take care of this. Next, we have our corrective action, verification, and records. I realize we're getting towards the end of our time, so I didn't want to go too much further. Are there additional questions, Michael?
I just see some comments in there, and I'll note I put a note in our template, Word template, on the records section to revisit that, to consider separating out and doing required records versus optional records, to make sure it's very clear in the models themselves when the trainers are teaching. And that was related back to Claudia's comment of likes to list the required first and then the optional records, using the headings required and optional, and then Deb noted doesn't mind, as long as they understand which ones are required and which are optional.
Okay. And if we want to do this again, if folks can let us know which model they want to review, that would be great.
What else? Are there any other questions? So I am going to put a link in the chat to an evaluation for today's webinar, which has an option for you to indicate future topics. You can also include another model you might want to go through or any other comments or suggestions you have. We do have one more webinar scheduled for, or to be scheduled for this year. So we can look at, and then our plan right now is to continue with 3 a year, the first of the year just being an update from the executive committee. There are some more comments coming in. CCP did not mention the verification requirement for the CCP monitoring to be included in a weekly review. The verification requirement for the CCP. Okay, we'll revisit that CCP.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Okay, and then Claudia noted that they've had firms written up for not having the optional records. So it's very helpful to indicate what's required and what's optional for training purposes.
Okay.
Right, and as I said, I made that comment directly in our notes to go back and we'll share that with the models committee to go back and take a closer look at the records section.
Okay, in addition to the 5 models that I told you are very close to being posted on the Florida website, the rest of them are also being revised. We're in the process of reviewing the revisions, and when that's done, we will post them to the Florida website. We're also working on a new model, a lobster processing model, and that should be coming out soon as well. And you're more than welcome to suggest additional models to be developed. And we recommend that you do the hazard analysis, the process description or narrative, and the CCP or the HACCP plan in the same format as the current models.
And Doris, I'd also add to that, because it can be challenging to manage so many models, any new models should be addressing and utilizing a chapter that one of our existing models does not already utilize. Because again, the intent of these models is to help navigate and introduce the reef content in the hazards guide. And if there is a model or a chapter that's not really addressed or covered very heavily with one of the models, and you think that that's important, that's more what we'd be looking for new models, because it's going to be challenging if we just have a model for every commodity, every situation to manage and update those. I also apologize, the tips and tricks sheet that Doris was talking about earlier, I sent it in the chat, but just to the host. So I just added it to the chat now.
Okay. Well, we've covered quite a bit today. And I thank everybody for signing up and attending.
Thanks, everyone. Be sure to take that evaluation and let us know what you want to see next.
Okay.
I'm going to end the webinar now.
All right. Thanks, Christina.
Thank you, Christina.
Bye.
Bye-bye.